Gracious God, whether through me or in spite of me, may your word be heard this morning. So, we live in a world, most everybody's over here, they sort of adjust accordingly, there you go. Well, we live in a world that's characterized too much, too often, by death, by destruction, by negative forces, by hellish forces. Our world is full of hellish, destructive forces. Forces like addiction, like violence, like disease, like power politics, like selfishness, or greed, or fear. This is the world that we live in too often. A world of death, a world of hellish forces. So we shouldn't be surprised, we shouldn't be too surprised when God's messengers end up in some hellish places. God's messengers, after all, are called and sent by God to bring God's message of life and fullness and hope into these dark and death-dealing hellish places. So we shouldn't be surprised when that conflict ends up with God's people in a less than enjoyable situation. I'm reminded by a German pastor. I'm reminded of a German pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who lived during the time of Hitler and Nazism in Germany, and he stood up. He stood up against it. He saw that these were forces of death, that these were hellish forces, and so he put his obedience to God, his allegiance to God, before his obedience to his own people, before his obedience to his country, before his obedience to his nation. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer ended up in Nazi prison for it. And a few months before he died, a few months before he was executed by the Nazis, he was executed by the Nazis a week or two before the prison where he was staying at was liberated in 1945. But a few months before that, he wrote this poem called Jonah. In fear of death, they cried aloud, and clinging fast to wet ropes, straining on the battered deck, they gazed in stricken terror at the sea, that now, unchained in sudden fury, lashed the ship. O gods, eternal, excellent, provoked to anger, help us, or give a sign, that we may know who has offended you by secret sin, by breach of oath, or heedless blasphemy or murder, who brings us to disaster by misdeeds still hidden, to make a paltry profit for his pride. Thus they besought. And Jonah said, Behold, I send before the Lord of hosts, my life is forfeit. Cast me away. My guilt must bear the wrath of God. The righteous shall not perish with the sinner. They trembled, but with hands that knew no weakness, they cast the offender from their midst. The sea stood still. So last time I was over here, a couple weeks ago, we started a 4-part series on the book of Jonah, which you may remember from Children's Sunday School or VeggieTales. Last time we talked about chapter 1. Jonah, who is this guy, he's God's called one, he's God's chosen one. He's called to spread God's blessing, God's salvation, God's message of hope and life to the nations, and yet he does everything he can to avoid that mission. And but in the end, we get this messenger of God who has tried to avoid spreading God's good news to the nations. He is sinking below to the depths of the seas, and the nations, these sailors who are kind of from all over the place, are above on the boat in calm waters, and they're praising God. So we have this just intense irony. God's chosen one who has tried to reject that chosenness is sinking, and the ones who are not God's chosen one, the ones to whom God's chosen one is supposed to be sent, are praising God. And you laughed. Many of you guys laughed, which is appropriate, actually. Many of you, when we got to that point in the story, I think a lot of you 2 weeks ago, when we got to that point in the story, you saw the irony, and we got some chuckles, which was pretty appropriate. Jonah is actually a kind of a comedy. It's kind of a comedy because it is sort of funny, it's sort of ironic, in some kind of weird and surprising ways. The chosen one of God is doomed, and the ones who are not chosen by God are praising God. There's an intense irony to that. But Jonah is also a comedy in that it has a happy ending. It's a comedy in the same sense that like a Shakespearean comedy is a comedy. Not just that it's funny, but that it's not a tragedy. It has a happy ending. I wanted to remind you that before we get too deep into today, because today, in a sense, we're following Jonah into the depths of hell. So we pick up last week where we left off, the last verse of chapter 1, which probably is not on the slides, but meanwhile, the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And then chapter 2 begins, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. If you remember in chapter 1, Jonah was asked by the captain, Jonah was begged by the captain, who had no idea who he was, to get up. He was sleeping. He was begged by the captain to get up and to pray for the ship to save it, because this violent storm was happening, and the captain was begging him, "Wake up! What are you doing? Why are you sleeping in the middle of the storm? Wake up and pray. Maybe your God has something to do with this, and he can help us." But Jonah doesn't ever pray until right now. So to recap, Jonah went through a violent storm. He was thrown overboard into the waters of that storm, and he sank down deep. He was saved, kind of, by some weird mechanism. A giant ship swallowed him, and then he hung out in the ship for 3 days and 3 nights, and now, finally, he's going to pray. So Jonah's a little bit reluctant. He's a little bit reluctant. He didn't pray because of the violent storm. He didn't pray when he was sinking down below the waves to his basically certain doom. And he didn't pray until 3 days in the belly of this fish that miraculously saved him. So God's prophet is pretty reluctant here, but he does finally pray. Jonah has finally come around. He's finally going to pray. And here's what he prays. I called out to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me. From the belly of the underworld, I cried out for help. You have heard my voice. So the first thing, this is a prayer from the underworld. This is a prayer from Sheol, this place of darkness and death. Essentially, it's a prayer from hell. And we remember that God originally commanded Jonah to get up and to go to Nineveh and to cry out against it. So he got up, but then he went down to Joppa, this seaport town, and then he went down into the boat, and then he went down to the bottom of the boat, and then he went down into a deep nap. And now he's sinking down into the depths. But from these deep, deep places, Jonah is actually kind of crying out in a sense of hope. This deepest place, Sheol, this deepest place that's furthest from hope, it's not, it turns out, unreachable for God's hope. Jonah, it's interesting here, Jonah is praying as if God has already answered him, which is weird because God has definitely not answered him yet. This is a prayer of hope. Sheol, death, the underworld, is a place without voice. And yet Jonah prays in the hope that God has already heard his voice. So this is, in a sense, a prayer of hope from hell. He goes on, "You would cast me into the depths, in the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounds me. All your strong waves and rushing water passed over me." So the seas in a sort of a Jewish imagination are these places of chaos and destruction, unpredictability, and sort of doom. And this is where Jonah lives now. This is where he finds himself. He kind of maybe is making reference to Noah too. The flood surrounds me. But Jonah isn't on the ark. The sailors praising God up above, they're on the ark. Jonah is sinking down below with the sinners, with the condemned ones. He goes on, "So I said, I have been driven away from your sight. Will I ever again look on your holy temple? Waters have grasped me to the point of death. The deep surrounds me." So we have more talk about these chaotic waters, these chaotic seas. They're surrounding, they're engulfing to the point of death. We also have this reference to God's temple. God's temple is the high point in God's geography. Okay? God's temple is at the height. God's temple is the peak of God's geography. And yet, so like in the Psalms, you have, for instance, these songs of ascent, where people are journeying up the Temple Mount, and they're supposed to pray these things as they go up to the temple. The temple in sort of God's geography is at the height, and yet Jonah is in the depths. Jonah is kind of in the opposite place. God's temple, this place where heaven and earth meet, it sort of anticipates the eventual marriage, the eventual union, the eventual coming together of heaven and earth. That place is sort of the height of God's geography on earth, and Jonah finds himself in the depths. And here he finally yearns for the temple, the one who is defined by all these acts of going down when he was told to get up. He finally yearns for the temple. So this is possibly the beginnings of a kind of repentance for all of Jonah's going down. Seaweed is wrapped around my head at the base of the undersea mountains. So this was interesting, I thought. The word here for seaweed is suf. The word here for seaweed is suf. It's the same word that is also translated reeds, that are the reeds that catch the baby Moses' basket in the Nile and essentially save his life. It's the reeds among which Pharaoh's daughter found Moses' basket and saved him, right? But it's also the reeds that, actually the name for, the Red Sea, the Israelites passed through the Red Sea out of Egypt and into freedom in the wilderness. It's actually, literally, it's the Sea of Reeds, it's the Sea of Suf. Most of our translations say the Red Sea, but it's actually the Sea of Suf. So Jonah here, when he says that the Suf is wrapped around his head, he's also maybe he's in the basket with Moses, just barely getting saved by this act of God, or maybe he is in the Suf with Pharaoh's army drowning. Probably more the latter. Then I have sunk down to the underworld, its bars held me with no end in sight, but you brought me out of the pit. So we have more sinking, more going down, and Jonah here is imprisoned behind these bars in the deep. So he's hopeful, but you brought me out of the pit, he prays. But remember, he's still in the pit. He's still very much in the pit. Reading on. When my endurance was weakening, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. Get a little bit more hope, remembering the Lord. Jonah, it feels like his prayer is getting to God, which is pretty remarkable because Jonah's praying from the depths, where his prayer really is as far as it could be from God's holy temple, and yet he prays in the hope that God hears him. He goes on, those deceived by worthless things lose their chance for mercy. But me, I will offer a sacrifice to you with a voice of thanks. That which I have promised, I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. When Jonah says deliverance belongs to the Lord, literally it's more like salvation is from the Lord. And the word from salvation is very similar actually in Hebrew to the word for Jesus. There's a little bit of a leap, but come with me. The word for salvation is pretty close to the word for Jesus. So salvation is from the Lord in Jonah's lips sounds almost like the early Christian proclamation, Jesus is Lord. It's a little bit of a stretch, but he's kind of rhyming with the idea a little bit. Obviously, this is hundreds of years before Jesus, but this is kind of a remarkable little linguistic accident here. Jonah is almost proclaiming Jesus here in the depths of hell. But he said earlier, those deceived by worthless things lose their chance for mercy. They lose their chance for mercy, for God's loving kindness, for God's steadfast love, for God's generosity. But what's funny here, Jonah is kind of crying out against people who are deceived by worthless things. They're going to lose their chance for mercy. But Jonah actually, we find out in chapter 4, Jonah's issue, Jonah's beef this whole time, it turns out, was actually he didn't like God's mercy, God's generosity, God's loving kindness, God's steadfast love. So this is exactly what Jonah is rejecting. Jonah, in rejecting his calling, is rejecting God's mercy, God's love. It's the same word that's used there, hesed, God's loving kindness, God's steadfast love. So Jonah might be being a little bit disingenuous here. Jonah might be being a little bit disingenuous. He's not being totally authentic here. He's saying these really nice, pious-sounding things, but really his heart might not be totally in it. It is not there. So Jonah promises to sacrifice and to make good on his vows. Remember, the sailors above, they're sacrificing and they're making vows. Jonah had a vow. Jonah had a promise as God's chosen one. He had a calling. And he's sort of pledging here to, fine, I'll go to Nineveh and I'll do what you ask me to do. So to recap Jonah's prayer here, Jonah has come around, kind of. He has hope. He's praying as if God has already answered him. He's praying in the expectation of the God who saves even from the depths, even from death, even from the underworld, even from hell. He even almost sort of accidentally proclaims Jesus is Lord, which is pretty remarkable and kind of cool. But Jonah's pious prayer isn't totally pure. After all, it took him like 3 days to actually finally get around to praying it. And even though he says all these nice things about God's mercy, we will find out a little later that it's actually God's mercy that's been the problem that he's had here. The reason why he's rejecting God's calling is because he doesn't like God's mercy. He wants God to be mercy to who he wants God to be mercy to, not to whoever God wants to be merciful to. So Jonah is a little bit reluctant to pray still. It took him 3 days, and he actually rejects God's mercy. So his prayer isn't totally pure. It's kind of a mixed bag. It's kind of a mixed bag sort of prayer, which is why the next verse is so appropriate. Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto the dry land. So Jonah literally makes the fish throw up. Jonah gets saved, right, from the depths, from the belly of the underworld. But he gets saved in kind of a gross way, right? His hope gets vindicated. He says all these beautiful things, and they turn out to be true. God does hear him. God does save him. But God saves him. I think the way God saves him is sort of instructive, because Jonah's not through yet. We're not finished with Jonah yet. He's still kind of a mixed bag. And so Jonah makes the fish nauseous. Jonah's pious prayer, it's kind of a mixed bag. It sounds really nice, but it's kind of half true, and it took him long enough, right? The fish gets nauseous and just throws up. It's like, oh, gross, fine, just go do it then. So I think we should identify with Jonah, because we're a mixed bag too. We're a mixed bag too. Sometimes it takes us longer than it should for us to pray. And sometimes our prayers are full of some pious nonsense that we don't really believe or we don't really think. And yet, God hears us anyway. Who knows? Perhaps the God will hear the prayers even of us, even of those who take even longer than 3 days to come around to pray, even of those who take even longer than 3 days to cry out to God from the depths, even from the depths of hell. So we should identify with Jonah, but we should also identify Jesus with Jonah. Jesus actually, in fact, identifies himself with Jonah. In this world of death and hellish forces, the ancient peoples, especially the Hebrews, in sort of this Jewish imagination that the Old Testament was written from, death is kind of this force that swallows stuff. It's kind of what death does. It just swallows everything. Death eventually, sooner or later, death overtakes us all and will swallow everything in this sort of ancient understanding. But Jesus is God's faithful one, who, when he was swallowed by death, makes death vomit. And all the things that death has swallowed come up and back into fullness and back into life. I was trying to think of it. What is that medicine that you take to make you throw up if you swallow poison or something?
Emetic.
Ipecac.
Emetic.
Sure, that. Jesus is like that for death. When death swallows Jesus, Jesus dies on the cross for us. And death swallows Jesus, but death can't contain him. And after 3 days, just like Jonah was laid up in the belly of the fish for 3 days, Jesus is laid up in the grave for 3 days. And Jonah, it's kind of like his unfaithfulness sort of makes, his sort of mixed bag, I guess, sort of makes the fish vomit him up back into life. But for Jesus, it's his faithfulness, it's his goodness, it's his purity, it's the beauty of his hope and his obedience to God that destroys death, that causes death to throw up everything that it's ever swallowed. So God's faithful one makes death vomit. So be encouraged. Be encouraged. In this world of death, we have a God of life, after all. And we're called to be a people of life, who place our God of life above and beyond all our other allegiances. So we can be courageous. We can be courageous to go out and to proclaim this life, to speak of this life, to hope in this life. We can even face down death like Bonhoeffer did, or like Jesus did, because we know that even if death and hell overwhelm and conquer us, we have a God who makes death sick to its stomach. And this is good news.